So what we have for doing this is just a piece of a PTO shaft that we cut off and we had to shorten it, but it doesn't matter what you use really. You can use any object like this. A little block of wood would even probably do it, as long as your pistons aren't really badly seized. So you got to put that in the bottom there in order to space it out a little bit. And then open up your clamp. And you got to fight with the back a little bit like I mentioned, but if you can find a good place to put the back of the clamp on, blocking the camera here of course, it should be relatively easy. You can see the piston going in there. This one is very free, it's relatively new, so it's not hard at all to push it in. If you have calipers that are a lot older, higher mileage, rusty, then this might be more challenging. And the brake fluid will slowly bleed out the bottom, which is what you want. You want to take the piston in as far as you can make it go. And what you're looking to see that is happening, and you won't be able to see it on camera necessarily, but when you squeeze a little bit and then release, the piston should bounce back a little bit. If it doesn't, it means you need to work it more before you reassemble your brakes. So this one, like I said, it's relatively new, it's very free. It's bouncing back every time I release my clamp, so I'm not at all worried about that. Of course, you're fighting with the back of the caliper here, which makes it, I think that is the bottom. So you'll get to a point where it stops moving, and when you release, it should bounce back a little bit. And if that's the case, so that you know you've reached the bottom of the piston. And that's done. What you can do if it looks like it's a little bit dirty, you take a little wire brush and just, without hurting the boot, because you don't want to nick the boot or put any little holes in it, because that's what keeps the dirt and water out, stops your piston from rusting. You just want to get the little bit of dirt and surface rust off of the surface that the pad goes against. Once you've got that, again, this one's in really good shape. If you end up with one that's really rusty, you have to spend a lot more time on it. Don't forget to take your little spacer out. I've had that happen before, where you get it all put back together and realize you left it in there. So get that out of there, and then if you have air at your disposal, just blow out that and gently around here, because otherwise you end up with brake fluid going everywhere. Just a little bit like that. You don't want to take all the brake fluid out, you're just trying to get the excess off so it doesn't drip onto the rotor and pads, then you have no brake. One thing to note, these bleeder screws are supposed to have a little boot on them. I noticed this one is missing. It's not a problem right now, but if you ever need to bleed the brakes because you had to replace a brake line or a flex line, you need to be able to not only crack this loose to get the air out, but the end of it needs to be clear as well. These from factory, from the store, are supposed to have a little rubber boot that keeps the dirt and the water out of there. And if you're putting calipers on, whether it be new or even a used set from another one, you want to make sure you crack this loose, clean it out, and if you have anti-seize available to you, clean up those threads. Something you don't want to do if you're doing what I'm doing right now is you don't want to open that right now, because you're just letting air into your brake system and fluid out. So right now I'm not going to touch it, but in the future, if you ever want to bleed brakes, if this hasn't been maintained, you might end up just breaking it off, in which case you're replacing the caliper then. So just something to save yourself some money. Okay, so a lot of people at home won't have access to a bench grinder, but if you do, and you've got one with a wire wheel, power wire wheel on it, this is the easiest way to clean up your slide bolts here. This one is, that part is what you wish all of them looked like. Nice and clean, chrome still. Obviously there's some corrosion starting, and this is what happens when you get cheap aftermarket parts. If these were the original Volkswagen parts, they would all still be clean chrome right to the inside. This one's really bad. This is the lower one. And the hex is still okay, luckily, but it's bad rust. So the only thing you want to know about this is you don't want to touch the threads to the wire wheel, because that'll just flatten them over and then you won't be able to thread them in. So I'm just going to clean up these surfaces and the end of the threads and the end of the hex, and then we can put them in. If you've got a good surface like this, there's no point in touching it because you'll just take the coating off. So you just start at the inside of that. And you're just looking to take away any roughness, any abrasion, any corrosion, and look for it to all be a silver color like that. Another disclaimer warning, it might be a good idea to wear gloves when you're doing this because this wheel will take off your skin relatively quickly. So I've done it enough times that I know to keep my fingers away, but if you want to be on the safe side, it doesn't hurt to wear a pair of gloves while you're doing this. The other thing is, if you haven't used one of these before, it's very easy for the wire wheel to catch your part and flip it out of your hands. So oftentimes it's good to use this little table they give you. It helps. You're just looking to get rid of all of that. You can see the little bit of pitting starting there. These will probably have to be replaced the next time I service the brakes, but you're just looking for it to be smooth, and we'll just touch up the end of the... Anywhere there's rust, that's the starting point for corrosion. So if you can get rid of that, your brakes will last a lot longer. So that was the better one of the two. This one is really bad, so we'll hopefully be able to clean it up not too badly here. This one's really bad for pitting, but again, all you're looking for is for it to be smooth. Pits are a low spot. Low spots are okay. High spots like rust and shale are not okay. So you're just looking for it to be smooth. Sometimes you get a little bit of a sharp edge on this. If that does happen, it's not a bad idea if you have a stone available to you to just really gently go around the outside and then go back to the wire wheel just to take off the sharp edge. And that way, not only do you not cut yourself, but it won't hurt the boot on the car. I'll just do the threads on this one, and then we're ready to put them back in. Okay, so back to the power wire wheel again here. You're just gonna, without touching the threads, same thing as before, you don't want to hit the threads with the brush. You're gonna do the cone, and you might as well do the flats. That makes it easier to get the socket on and off and doesn't get stuck then. And you can do the end, and then we'll just hand wire brush the threads after that. So here we go. Again, if the threads look like they're relatively clean, there's actually some damage there. If they look like they're clean and there's no big chunks of rust, just quickly brush them, air them off if you have air, and then do your anti-seize or grease and they'll be just fine, especially for if you have to change a flat tire or your snow tires. So something you also want to do while you've got your brake pads off is you want to clean all of the points that make contact with the caliper and with the knuckle. I mean, you can make sure that your caliper is perfect, the sliders are clean, the piston's good, but if these seize on the carrier, then you're still after brake drag. So these ones are really new, obviously, tons of lining on them. You got your lining warning sensor here, but I'm just gonna quickly touch all the points that make contact to the wire wheel as well, and that guarantees that when we put it back together with anti-seize, that it'll be free for sure. So I'm just gonna do that quickly here, and then we should be able to put them on. You don't wanna hurt this wire. If you break the wire, then you got a light on the dash that's telling you your brake lining is worn out when it's not actually. You want to make sure you don't touch the lining to the wire wheel because it will just peel it off in a hurry. You won't even know what happened. You'll have a big chunk missing, so you don't want to touch that to it. Okay, so if you did take your rotor off to do this job, you want to just quickly wire brush the outside and the inside, just to make sure that there's no excess rust that's going to cause trouble with you getting it off the next time. And I wire brushed the hub earlier, so all I'm going to do now is put just a thin coat of anti-seize on the whole hub, any surface that's going to make contact with the rotor or with the rim, and that will save trouble in the future. This stuff coats really nicely. That's one downside. If you get it somewhere you don't want it, is it's hard to get off, but it does a nice job of coating the metal, protecting it from rust and corrosion, and it also makes it really nice and easy to get your fasteners undone the next time, and also to get your rim and your rotor off of the hub the next time you need to do brakes or even just change to winter tires. So coat that up like that. And while we're here, we might as well also put a coating on the knuckle where the caliper is going to sit. You don't want too much, because if you end up with anti-seize on your pads or your rotor, you're not going to have any brakes. So we want to avoid that at all costs. You can get a little bit excessive with the coating area, because it doesn't matter if there's anti-seize somewhere that doesn't have contact, it just stops it from rusting. So it's okay to have a coating on a larger area, just make sure you don't have a lot of excess sitting on it. The other nice thing about doing this with the rotor off is you don't risk getting any on the rotor surface when you're trying to apply it. If you still have your rotor on, you have to be a lot more careful that when you're brushing the anti-seize on here, that you don't get anti-seize on the braking surface. Especially since it spreads so easily, you'll end up with it all around, and then this wheel won't be braking at all for you. So what you also want to try and find is some kind of a silicone-based brake grease for the slide pins themselves. You don't want to put anti-seize on these pins, because anti-seize eventually dries out, and if you aren't doing your brake servicing once a year, even twice a year, depending, maybe spring and fall, then the anti-seize will dry out and you'll end up with the drag on the caliper that you don't want. So this silicone brake lubricant is intended to not dry out, and it keeps the water and dirt out and also lubricates the sliders so that they'll move freely. So I'm just going to put a nice coat on the surface of both pins, and then once we put the caliper on, you just slide them in from the back, and then we will look up the torque spec, get that torqued, and that will about do it. I'm going to put the rotor on here. Even though we can't put the alignment screw in, I'm still going to put it in the right place. Helps with positioning. On there, and you grind it in a little bit to make sure that there's no pebbles or dirt or anything behind. And if you had enough anti-seize on there, when you do that, it should actually hold it in place for you. In this case not, but maybe sometimes you luck out. So in this case you might have to get a block of wood, or if you can get your toe on it to hold it while you put the caliper on. In this case it's not too big of a deal yet, when we still have to put the pads in the caliper. So the inner pad here, before we do that, should put a little bit of anti-seize on your pads as well. We're going to do this inner one first. Again, you don't want to get any anti-seize on the pad lining surface. You just want to put some on the part that we cleaned on the wire wheel, because this is what's going to make contact with the part on the carrier that we just put some on as well. You just want to put a little bit on each one to cover it and to help with keeping it free and lubricated as well. Just like that, and then we can clip this one in. Be careful that you don't end up with anti-seize all over everything. These clips are sometimes a little tricky. You got to kind of squeeze them with your fingers to get them started, and then they'll pop in there. Rotate position like that, and we'll probably try and plug the wire in as we're putting the caliper on. I'm not sure what it would be like to try and do it once the caliper's on, so you might want to remember that while you're trying to put it together. Bit more anti-seize here. That. It may or may not stay in there fully, but once it's on the rotor it won't move for you. Okay, so I'm gonna try and juggle this with 3 hands here now. Get the rotor back up where it needs to be. And then if you were able to get the piston all the way back, then the pads should have more than enough room to slide easily into position. You want to make sure the top and bottom is in fully. And you can let go of the rotor for now, but you'll have to make sure that it's up in place before you tighten the caliper slide bolts. So I'm gonna take a look in here and make sure that we're close for the bolts. And hopefully that'll stay there for a minute while we put some grease on the slide pins. Again, you don't want a lot for these either. You just want a coating to protect and to lubricate. Put this somewhere not gonna end up with dirt in it. Hold it by the threads in this case. It would be nice to put some anti-seize on the threads, but you end up with grease everywhere when you do it that way. So we'll see what we can do here. What you can do is put the bolt on the tool once you've done the grease here. And I usually put a little bit of grease inside the boot so that the pin takes it with it. So if you have your internal hex bit, you put it in there, and that gives you something then to hold on to while you put a little bit of anti-seize on the threads only. Just the threads so that it doesn't rust too badly that you can't get it undone the next time. Just like that. So now it does look like we'll be able to put the plug in. You might have to bend the bracket a little bit, but we'll wait on that for the moment. So I'm going to try and get this pin in here now. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, but you need to be able to look inside to line up the bolt threads with the threads in the knuckle. And you want to make sure that you're starting it by hand. If you start it with a tool and you cross thread it, then you're going to be into a lot more money and time as well. So I'm going to try and get the rotor to stay up here again for me now. Maybe it'll stay there for me while nope. This is why it's very nice to have the screw. So if you have the chance or the opportunity to fix your hub so that you have the screw to hold the rotor in place, because on these ones they did not make the lip for the rotor nearly wide enough to hold it. And I don't have enough hands here, but if you can hold it there and tighten the slide bolts in as far as you can by fingers before you put any tools on them, that will reduce the risk of cross threading and stripping the thread. So that one bottomed on its own, which is what you want to see. And so I will put the grease on the other one here now. Just a thin coat. Again, you don't want a ton, or it'll just pile up on the outside and dirt will stick to it. So you're just gonna coat it like that, and I put a little bit inside. I can't even see it's inside the boot here. And then the internal hex tool again. And you put a little bit of anti-seize on the threads. And then in there. You might have to wiggle it if you can't get around to see. I can't see what's going on at the moment. It's hard to see the bottom to make sure that I can't see it at all actually. I can see that the bolt is lined up with the hole otherwise. And sometimes it can be aligned but a little bit crooked, and it'll never start without cross threading, and you do not want to do that. So take the time to, if you have to get down underneath to look to make sure that you've got it started properly, and again, only with fingers. Don't use any tools until you're ready to torque to the spec. Get this one in all the way here. And that one bottomed as well, which is what you want to see. You can use the ratchet or a small bar just to put a little bit on it, but the torque spec for these is not very high, so you don't want to go past that before you even get to the point of torquing it. So just snug it like that, and then we're going to go look up the torque spec in the service manual, and we'll come back and torque that up. Okay, so last thing you want to do aside from torquing the caliper is make sure that you remember to plug your brake lining sensor back in. Make sure there's no extra dirt in there that shouldn't be in either side. If you have some dielectric grease available, sometimes it's a good idea to put that in there just to help insulate the connection and to keep water and dirt out. You push it back together, it should be click, and you know it's in the right place then. Just make sure the wire's not going to get pinched. Make sure it's clear of everything. And then now we're going to torque the caliper bolts. I did check in the Bentley service manual, it is 22 foot-pounds for the front caliper bolts. The rears might be different, so if you're doing rear, make sure you check that it's different or not. And if you don't have a manual, all of this information can be found online. There's lots of forums that talk about it as well. So what I'm going to do, NTC's all over me here. What I'm going to do, because I don't trust this torque wrench a whole lot, is I'm going to start low and slowly step my way up to make sure that it doesn't over tighten the bolt, because it will just strip the threads. So 22, so I'm going to start at 15, I guess. You want to make sure that you've got a torque wrench that goes low enough. If you've got a torque wrench that starts at 20, going to 22 is going to be, you know, relatively inaccurate. You'd rather have a torque wrench that started at like 5 or 10. This one goes from 10 to 80, so 22 is like a quarter of the range. If you've got a torque wrench that starts at 20 and goes to 250, the accuracy at the low end and at the high end is you know, a long way off of the number that you actually want. So if you can find a torque wrench with a lower range, that would be best. So I'm going to start at 15, like I said here, and just see how it's behaving. The threads were in good shape, so it shouldn't be terribly hard to make it click without feeling like it's going to strip. And if it is behaving like it's not tightening up, what you can do is just put your hand on the head to kind of help. That one clicked not too badly. Can't see the bottom one here. You just want to feel. You don't want to do it blindly, waiting for the torque wrench to do the work for you. You need to be paying attention, especially with an older car. So we'll go up to, maybe we'll go up to 18 now. And then make the final step, the 22, just to give it a little more chance to catch up. You should not feel any squishy feeling. It should feel like it's tight already. You're just adding a little more to it. If it continues to turn and doesn't tighten, make sure you stop right away. It either means there's something stuck between the bolt and the boot surface on the inside, or the thread is starting to strip or pull, and you don't want that to happen. That's more work and cost. So it pays to be paying attention, take it slow, make sure you're paying attention to what it's doing. Like that to me almost is too much force required to make it click. So I'm just going to help it like that and stop there, because I don't want to get into that right now either. Having to replace the carrier because the threads are stripped is a pain. In this case, on the fronts, it's part of the knuckle. On the rears, at least, I'm pretty sure you can replace this part. But on the fronts, you have to replace the whole knuckle if you pull the threads out of it. Otherwise, you're into doing a Healy coil, which doesn't usually work very well. So there we have it. The brakes are complete. The rotor, of course, here still will not stay up where it's supposed to be. Okay, so we're just doing the rear on this 02 Jetta now, and we just thought we would show you the main difference between the front and the back. Most things are the same. The main thing you have to know about these calipers on the back here is you can't just push them straight in. I don't know if you can see, there's 2 notches in the caliper, and for these ones you have to push and turn it in at the same time. So there's some of those little cube tools that you can use with a ratchet that are available, but it's awfully difficult compared to what we've got here to use. This tool, you put the 2 pegs in the 2 notches in the piston, and this plate hooks inside the caliper, and then you just snug up the nut, and then you can wind this and it pushes it in and rotates the piston at the same time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to blow the dust out of the boot here, and I'll put a little bit of brake fluid in it for lubrication. I can't get in here. And you just want to put it in until you can see it. I can't even see it, it's getting dark. Until you can just see it start to come up. In this case, I'm not really worried about it having a ton because the piston's in such great shape. If you've got a really rusty one, then you want to add more and work the piston in and out several times. Because this one's in super good shape, I'm just going to put it in once to show you how the tool works and how the piston itself works. I got enough hands here. So you wind that down, and then you got to make sure the two notches seat into the piston, and then you just back up the nut and tweak it a little bit. And then I haven't tried this one yet, but it should just wind around like that, and it's pushing the piston back and rotating it at the same time. The reason for this is because the parking brakes on these cars are actually activating the caliper. It's not inside the drum. It's not a separate mechanism. It's actually, the cable actually comes into the caliper, and there's an arm on the end that actually activates the piston through this threaded mechanism. So when you're pushing it in, you can't just use the vice grip C-clamp like you do on regular ones, or like we did on the front. If you do that to this, you'll damage it, and then you'll have to buy new calipers, and they're definitely not cheap. So I would recommend that you either pick up a tool like this, or at least get one of those fancy little cube ones. And one thing you got to do when you're doing this here is just let out air and excess brake fluid as you push the piston in. You want a little bit of brake fluid in there to lubricate the seal and also to protect the metal from rust and corrosion, but you don't want to have so much that the boot's starting to bloat. And then eventually it just comes to a stop. You don't want to torque it too much or you'll hurt it. Which way is this supposed to go here now? This way. There we go. And get this out of the way, and then it's in there bottomed, ready for you to put new brake pads on and reinstall the caliper.